I feel like after all of that, I feel like I ought to introduce myself too, and I mean really, because because my approach um, is my approach, and I've always been because you'll see if you don't already know, you'll see in a minute where I came to this from, and I always have. I used to always have to preface all of my remarks on Corbin with many disclaimers because I had an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and that gives you the swollen ego that makes you think that you can probably think about anything, and that's a good thing. But then, long story, I ended up with graduate degrees in biology. But once a philosopher, always a philosopher. So I was always interested in many different things. And then in about 1990, I discovered, well, first, this is all pertinent, so I'll go ahead and be really autobiographical. I was doing theoretical biology, and I was being very abstract and heady. And I was about 38 years old, and I started to have what you could kindly call a psychotic breakdown. And I mean, I was always functional, but I thought that maybe Jungian psychology would be something I ought to think about. And by happenstance, I'd never heard of James Hillman, but I saw one of his books in a bookstore in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I was doing theoretical biology, and I thought, well, that looks interesting. It was The Blue Fire, the book that Tom Moore wrote, that he edited, and I put it on my shelf. And a few weeks later, I started looking at it, and I was just completely floored. And I thought, this guy, this is what I've been looking for my entire life. Because you realize very soon when you look into Hillman and all, that he puts the imagination at the center of everything, period, full stop, center of everything. And so I was utterly entranced. I got myself a good Jungian analyst who helped me stay grounded. And I read Hillman and a little Jung, which I had not much ever before, but actually a lot of Jung. I read everything I could get my hands on by Hillman and a lot of Jung, and I bounced back and forth between the two of them for maybe a couple of years. And then I chanced to, and here's the important part from our point of view, I chanced upon Hillman's 81 or 83 Eranos lecture, The Thought of the Heart, which he starts by talking about Henry Corbin. And if you've not read it, you should. And he begins by saying, basically, this is the man. That this is the guy. If you want to know anything about the imagination, this guy was imagination. And I thought, who the hell is that? Because I was so entranced by Hillman, I thought, if this is Hillman's hero, and it was quite clear that Corbin was Hillman's hero, and I still defend that, then I should know something about him. So back in the day, before internet and before Amazon, I had to find a copy of Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and I started to read it. And you know what that's like. Coming to Corbin completely, well, so coming to Corbin from Hillman and Jung is where I came in, right? And so that triad has always framed my thinking about Corbin and the imagination. In the ensuing 30 years, I hope, filled in a lot of gaps, but my approach to Corbin is via Hillman. And so I don't have any of the relevant languages except some not very good French. I don't have the relevant degrees. I don't have all the things that one needs academically to do this stuff, but I didn't have any choice, so I was doing it. And then the first book, The World Turned Inside Out, I've been reading Corbin for a few years, and I just had it all in my head. And I was tremendously confused by it. And I thought, I should write this down. I should put this in some sort of form because I don't know what I'm thinking, and I'm really confused. And so I just started writing this thing that I thought might be just useful for me. And after several days, I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. This is kind of a nice article. And I had no idea where it would be published. I mean, I'm a biologist. What do you do? And by the time I finished my little article, I thought, well, shit, this is almost a book. This is like really long article. And I thought, well, I'll send it to Hillman, because I knew he had spring publications, and I wanted to know if it was any good. And he said, yeah, yeah, it's really good. And he published it. Oh, there's a long story there. And he agreed to publish it for me. And in the meantime, while it was in the process of gestating, and while the publication process was going on, I got really nervous. And I thought, well, shit, I don't know anything about any of this stuff, and I'm going to publish a book. So I got in touch with Charles Adams at McGill. Because I'd run across his writings on Corbin, which were small, but he knew Corbin. And so I just sent the manuscript, cold call. I just sent the manuscript to McGill and Charles Adams and said, if you have the time, would you take a look at this and let me know, all the mistakes I must have made? And he came back, weeks later and said, this is magnificent. It's wonderful. It's fantastic. You should absolutely publish it. And I thought, how did that happen? I don't know anything about this stuff, So Hillman and Adams, and I thought, all right, I'll publish it, and we'll see if anybody likes it. And so, to my continuing surprise, people did, and I didn't have any choice because I was working through all this stuff, and I just kept writing. And I kept going back to Corbin, and then Hillman, and then Corbin, and then Jung, and then poetry, and then art, and then back to Corbin. And I kept trying to fill in the spaces, but I have no background to speak of in any of this, So I always feel bad about my lack of. Oh, here's a good story. So there's a woman from Argentina, Monica Udler. I can't remember, she's Argentine or Brazilian. And she got in touch with me some time ago and told me, I'm about to publish my dissertation on Corbin. I just want to thank you so much for it. And we communicated a little bit, and she said, I'm a little embarrassed, you're actually not in my bibliography because my committee wouldn't let me put you there because they said you weren't academic enough. And I gotta say, that's exactly right. They're completely right. But she said, but I wouldn't understand Corbin if it hadn't been for you. So, anyway, there's my disclaimers about all of this material. It does turn out that people who do know about Corbin have almost universally told me I got something right. So there you go. That's my explanation. I don't know why I got Corbin right, but apparently I did. And the other thing I'll say before we get into questions is that I've been reading Corbin since about 91 or 92. And the first book was very consciously written to be an objective account of what I was intuiting was Corbin's point of view. All the writings after that I've cared less and less about being true to Corbin, except on occasion, when I say that I think this is what Corbin thought. And at this point, it's increasingly hard for me to distinguish me from Corbin, from Hillman, and so when I get really confused about things, I fall back on a position where I say, well, I think here's what Corbin thought about it, because I may not know what I think about it. Anyway, so that's the story of me and Henry Corbin.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. That helps get us started here, I think. Perhaps what we could ask you right off the bat here, since it was Alone with the Alone that we read in particular, though some of us have more of a background with Corbin beyond just this text. What would you say is the sort of unique value of this work of his, and how is it kind of situated in his larger
of this book
collection? Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, so it was written when he was, I mean, he wrote a lot of things afterwards, but it was written when he was a mature thinker, Was it like 58 in the French edition, I think? Yeah, boy, is it really 58? Yeah, so he was, yeah, because it's really 2 Eranos lectures, and he came to Eranos in 48, I think, because he replaced Louis Massignon, because Massignon wouldn't shut up about Algeria, and nobody wanted to talk politics there. It was one of the rules of Eranos: you don't talk politics, and Louis Massignon was having none of it. So they kind of eased him out, and they needed an Islamicist, so they got Corbin. He took Massignon's place at the Sorbonne when Massignon retired. So the first of these lectures that make up this book, I'm pretty sure it was published in French in 58, so it was probably Eranos at 56 or 57. And he's already a mature thinker. He's all his main themes are there. And there's so many things to say. One thing to say, but which I'm full of little footnotey things. So before we get to the substance, one of the things you'll notice after 48, for a number of years, and I don't know, Hadi Fakhouri probably knows how many years, but there's a period of 6 or 7 years where he uses Jungian terminology occasionally. He likes to talk about coming to consciousness, and he doesn't use the word complexes, but he likes imago. You'll find that in Avicenna. And he uses terms, creative imagination, and active imagination. He'll use that as a term. So he's using Jungian terms, or at least if one knows that he is, you recognize it. But he stops doing that after a few years, and this is, yeah, to help situate this book. It's during that period where he and Jung are kind of getting to know each other, and Corbin's borrowing some of his terms because he's lecturing at Eranos, and the people there know Jung. But after a while, they both sort of recognize that they're meeting. But I just had to edit a thing where somebody was commenting that Corbin was a big influence on Jung. And that's just not true. And it's also not true the other way. When these guys met, and Jung was, 20 years older or something? When these guys met, they were both fully formed intellects. And they met and they realized they had a lot in common. But then, Corbin realized, I don't want to use these terms that are sort of tinged with psychology. because I don't want anybody to think that I'm a psychologist, because I don't want to get involved in all that reductionism nonsense. I'm a theologian. I don't need that stuff. I got the real thing. You know, Jung is always saying, well, I really can't say anything about God because I'm a psychologist. And he's always got to turn himself, you know, into these little knots saying, well, I got to be objective about this. I can't say anything definitive about that. And Corbin just doesn't have any of those problems at all. For Corbinian reasons. Hillman doesn't have those problems either, but he doesn't have them for Hillmanian reasons, which are really quite different. So one of the things situating this book and situating Corbin in my little universe, it's been really always interesting to play these three and then others that I've written about here and there off against each other, because for Jung and Corbin and Hillman, the imagination is central. But they're all standing in funny different places, and therefore they each have a really idiosyncratic vision of what the imagination is and what it can do and how to think about it and how to embody it. And then the same goes for the poets who adopted Corbin's, who were very enthusiastic about Corbin's works. And as is the case with comparative religion or comparative literature, comparative imaginal studies, whatever you want to call this, does open you're less apt to get stuck in one version of what the imagination is. And I think that's of the essence of what particularly Corbin and Hillman have to give us. And I should be a little careful here about my view of Jung and Jungians. So let me try to be careful about what I'm likely to say. There are Jungians, right? And they have Jungian training institutes. There aren't any Corbinians for other reasons, but Corbin is not. He's far less easy. I don't want to put it that way. He's Jung. You can always find something in Jung's corpus where you say, "Aha! Here's what he thinks. Here's the truth." Corbin, you're never quite sure whether he's commenting on somebody or whether this is something he takes seriously. Does he really believe this shit, or is he just commenting on somebody? And he never tells you. He's always just sort of wandering around in these worlds that he clearly lives in, but he never sort of says, "Aha, here in this Central Asian Sufi, I have finally found the truth." He just never does anything like that, you know? He just wanders around being unsystematic. Whereas Jung has a very systematic approach, at least he tries to when he's pretending to be a scientist. But then when he's really being Jung, he does the Red Book or the alchemical writings. And they are as unintelligible in a good sense as Corbin or Hillman at their very best. Okay, so I take the best of all three of them to be their work when it is most nearly unintelligible. Okay, the best Jung is the stuff you can't understand. The best Corbin is when he's just out there floating. And the best Hillman, likewise, is when he's being nearly poetic. You know, he's almost over into poetry. I think, to get back to the question, of all of Corbin's books, is it my favorite? It's the one that I always recommend people start with. and I was telling Jared before everybody got here, the first time I ever taught Corbin was to a very unsuspecting group of junior undergraduate students who had no idea what they were getting into. They just liked me, and if I was going to teach it, they were going to take it. And we read this book, and I said, if you don't understand parts of it, just skip them and get to the parts that really seem neat and sweet. And it worked like a charm, you know. And you know what this book is like, because if you try to read it as an academic, you have to stop. I mean, you just can't go on, because you think, well, I can't do this, because look at these footnotes, and I don't read Arabic, I don't read Persian, I don't read German, I don't read Russian, I don't read any of this stuff. And then you, oh no, I don't know who this is, and you got to go look at. You can try to do that, or you can just skip to the parts where he talks about love and the angels, and you know, there's works of his. I mean, I have a friend who loves the Avicenna book. I actually find that really hard, and I always have. And I've always found this one to be the most engaging and the least off-putting. And I just did this in a course a while ago online. The other thing to be said about this book in particular, maybe, I'm looking at the contents. I mean, almost everything is here in this book. Who was it? Norman O. Brown says somewhere that I don't know if he's talking about Corbin's work, but if he were, he would have said, like the Quran, any page of Corbin's work has everything in it, you know? And in a sense, that's kind of true here with this book, that he's already a mature thinker. If you read stuff that comes later, he's adding things in, and he's packing, and he's putting stuff in there. But there are probably, I think it's probably safe to say, there are no new major themes to appear. Major. There's some cool stuff that happens after this, but if you read this book after having read everything, all the important stuff is right here, you know. I seem to have come to an end. So
may I ask just a little side follow-up question? You mentioned
commentary. The other question. You guys are in charge. I'm just enjoying this.
You mentioned, Tom, that you know, some of the vocabulary, like
I'm not hearing Kaleem, and I don't know why that is.
Can the others of you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay.
I sometimes have trouble with my little earphone thing.
Okay, Tom. Yeah, just a side question. You mentioned the vocabulary influence from Jung of active imagination, creative imagination. I'm wondering about the vocabulary about the angel, because that's sort of an idiosyncratic kind of translation, and he brings it in. You know, where does that come from? Is that you know, his reflection on, you know, the Iranian religion, or where does that terminology of the angel come from?
Well, one thing we don't have that we really need, and I'm in no position to do it, we don't have a good biography of Corbin, you know, and everybody's dying. You know, all the people that were part of that knew him personally, they're all old now. And there is no good, you know, so anything that I say, and I have opinions, but they're not based on scholarship. They're based on intuition. My guess is, I mean, it's more than a guess, but it would be great to have a biography. he was raised in Catholic schools. He was apparently raised by French Catholics, but there's a strong Protestant. He spells his name with a Y. And everybody always gets it wrong. He spells his name the English way, not the French way. It's Henri with a Y. And I think he had some relatives who were British, but I don't know that for a fact. So I think there's Catholicism and Protestantism in his background. And he was educated in the Catholic tradition. And you will all know that he knew everything that you could know about the Christian tradition. And he says in that wonderful interview with, boy, it's been a while, that interview that he gave late in life with the French guy, he says, I've always been interested in angels, that interest in angelology has been with me my entire life. And so my assumption has been that he had a really profound connection with Western mysticism in the tradition of Dionysius and all those angelological people in the Western church. And then he's obviously also really attracted by Eastern Christianity, which is why he learned Russian so that he could read Bulgakov and the others. One of the things that I loved about Corbin is because I'm a real sucker for people who know other languages, and there's plenty of you here now. And in some other life, I would come back as a linguist. So Corbin's facility with languages was also a reason that I thought, I got to take this guy seriously. So I trace his angelological concern, as he says somewhere. I trace it back to the Catholic tradition, and this speaks to that topic in Corbin, whether it addresses the source of your question. Is sort of beside the point, because I'm going to answer it this way. Notice the function of angels for Corbin. They're the mediators, because you never have God. That's one of the really attractive things about Corbin, is he says, you don't get God. Who are you thinking that God's talking to you? God's not talking to you. What kind of nut would think that? God is so far gone. Corbin's trying to do this meta monotheism, which somehow grounds transcendence in the immediate without running the risk of becoming a fundamentalist. So he says, if you don't have transcendence right here, then you got solid stuff, and you're going to end up as a scientist, and you're going to be a fundamentalist rationalist. The other mistake, and this is in that great footnote in this book, the twofold metaphysical idolatry. Yeah, this is it. Yeah. He says the other mistake is to think you got God, and that God's speaking to you, and that means that you know the truth, which means for most human beings, you got to go make sure other people agree with you. And if you don't, well, we often kill them. and Corbin says we can't do that either. But without transcendence, we're just screwed. So he needs some way of making the whole world permeable to, and so you got to have the imagination. And the grounding for the imagination, ultimately, of course, it's God, but what does it for you is the angels, which are plural, and that's the paradox of monotheism. So it's, his grand meta monotheism is pretty. I don't know that it's unique because I'm not trained enough in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to know for sure who else has said things like this. But Corbin tells us who he thinks have said things like this, and he names them now and then. In this book, of course, it's Ibn Arabi. And I don't know Ibn Arabi. My Ibn Arabi is all entirely filtered through Corbin, because otherwise you'd have to give up everything to do nothing but Ibn Arabi. And there's plenty of reason to do that, but it was never, going to be possible for me to just can it. So he's been criticized for turning Ibn Arabi into a crypto-Shiite and all that kind of stuff. And I have no opinion about that. I'm sure he did. In the same way that Heidegger took the pre-Socratics and turned them into little Germans. I'm sure that Corbin did the same thing with Ibn Arabi and all his favorite people, because what he is an incredibly creative post-Islamic Christian theologian. And that gives you this huge area to work in. And I think all that stuff is in this book. And so to answer your question, Kaleem, my guess is sometime when he was very young, he got maybe the experience of a visitation, which he then interpreted as an angel, which was a good move. He didn't say, aha, God just spoke to me, but an angel did. And then we know that he read all the medieval theologians, and that was just therefore, and I don't know Shuravardi either. So I can't really comment on it from the Shuravardian side, but what Corbin tells us of Shuravardi is that's where he got his idea of what a Persian angel would be about. And then he also got from Shuravardi the idea of the Harmonia Abrahamica. What Corbin says about Shuravardi is he was trying to take Zoroastrianism and Islam and put them together, because they clearly both had to be true, because he's Persian. He said, we got to have gotten this right at the beginning. And then God says, to all peoples I have given a prophet. So that makes sense. And Corbin says, all right, that's great. Shuravardi, my master, and he says many times, Shuravardi has always been my master since I started reading him. I'm going to try to do the same thing with Christianity and Judaism, and because it's all got to be one story. And for Corbin, the idea of the experience of the angel is central in so many ways. There's this business of the the prayer of man and the prayer of God, where the two things come to. That is the way I'm thinking of him now. That those passages are the center of his whole theology, where the angel, where, as he says puzzlingly the first times you read it, that you create your own God. And ooh, boy, you got to read that really carefully. But it's in that moment where the dualitude becomes conscious. That's what he means by angelophany. And that's the heart of his theology, I think, because it's the energies of the eternal Eve that are brought to bear in that moment of mutual recognition. That's where the light is born that allows you to see through everything and know thereby that nothing is permanent. it's very Buddhist in a lot of ways. And I say that not really knowing a whole lot of Buddhism, but that moment of letting go. You must, one of the things, I see what happens when I get excited about this, but one of the things that you should all read if you haven't is Theology au bord du lac, the Theology by the Lakeside, which is in the Learn volume, Henry Corbin, a big white book. I've translated it sort of poorly into English, but it's from 1932, I think, when he's in Sweden at the side of a lake, and it's only a couple pages long. Theology by the Lakeside is my English version, and Theology au bord du lac is the original French, which you should read. It's an experience of the natural world as an angelic presence, which is really poetic and deeply moving. And it's from 32, and we know that as a young boy, he was entranced by music, and he learned to play keyboards and to read music, and the musical themes throughout his work are really crucial. So the theme of the angel and the angelic hierarchies and light. I think he had those experiences as a young man, and those, he is not an intellect. No, let's say he is not an academic. And that's what pisses off all his colleagues. He's a creative theologian who is fundamentally a mystic. And then when he lands with, when Massignon gives him the copy of Suravarti, he just, you'd probably know that story. Massignon says, he hands him 500 pages of manuscript and says, I think that there is something in this book for you. And that was it, and then he spent the years of the war in Istanbul doing pretty much nothing but reading and translating Suravarti. And he says, that was it. He says, I was in because, and my interpretation is that all those experiences I had as a youngster, they're all right there. And now my job is to show why Suravarti and Christianity fit together. And he doesn't write very much about Judaism because even Corbin is finite. But what he's trying to do is to take, and the other thing, he's so enthusiastic about Zoroastrianism, and that really puzzles people. It sure drove me crazy for a while, but it comes up all the way at the end. It's not just in his early, the Cyclical Time essay, which is so maddeningly but wonderfully, it's a great piece of work once you don't try to understand it too hard. But he sticks with the Zoroastrians all the way through to the end in one of those last pieces. He does that again in what is it? Apophatic theology as the antidote to nihilism, and he does the whole Zoroastrian thing again, which I find really endearing. I mean, who does that? I mean, nobody does that. It's completely crazy. Anyway, there's a kind of an answer to where the angels come from. I think he experienced them, and then he just kept finding places where people talked about him, and he says, "That's mine. I'm having that."
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that very thoroughgoing explanation.
Some of it might be true. It would be so nice to have a biography of him. I know Haifa Khoury McGill has been to Paris to look at the Corbin archive, and I guess there's a lot of stuff there. somebody should translate the 4 volumes on Islam Iranian, and that, yeah. So somebody one of these days ought to do all those things.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that would certainly help with a lot of understanding some of this stuff for our non-French speakers here.
Yeah.
So definitely. All right. So I think perhaps we could go to Andrew for our next question here. You were first to arrive, and we had some interesting stuff about a meta-monotheism come up, and I think that kind of fits into some of the ideas you wanted to discuss with the traditionalists and such.
Okay. Big question. And that maybe takes me into some of the stuff I sat on during the introduction. Okay, I introduced myself a little bit. An important part of my background is I come from a split household. I grew up basically Reformed Jewish, secular Jewish ancestry. My dad is a Zen Buddhist priest, and lived in Japan before I was born. He wrote a book on Japanese archery. And so that's I'm just trying to think how to lay this out chronologically. Okay. During college, when I first got exposed to this stuff, I was doing a deep dive into Zen and Buddhism and Eastern philosophy generally. That took me to Asia. Since 2016, I arrived in the New York area. I've been dating a woman who's from a much more observant Jewish family than I. I'm in her home right now, and we just got married last week.
Congratulations. All right.
Thank you. But basically, kind of with or without her and her family, I've been doing a deeper dive into the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
And in particular, since COVID hit, now I'm in a position where all this stuff is coming at me from one conduit, which is through Zoom, right?
Yeah.
So I've had this discussion group. I had, a variety of Jewish learning-oriented discussion groups, and I'm doing meditation every morning online on Zoom. So I can no longer compartmentalize these things if I ever was able to.
Right.
Yeah. It sounded like you were going to say something. I don't want to cut you off.
No, that's, do you want to finish your question? You know what will happen if I get started.
Maybe if you got something to say, I want to hear it, and then I can redirect.
First of all, do you know your dad is not the only Jewish Zen master?
Yeah, I'm well aware.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
My favorite Jewish Zen master is Norman Fisher. He used to be, at least, with the San Francisco Zen Center, and he's also a poet, which also informs his writing about the intersection with Zen and Judaism. And Corbin is kind of perfect for a way to access those questions of intersectionality, I guess.
Well, I feel there's a lot of people who are doing work at that intersection, and mostly it's not very interesting to me. Mostly it's something that I prefer to distance myself from. But Corbin really gets into the real questions, I think.
Yeah, he does. So either phrase that as a question.
Yeah, it's not yet phrased as a question.
Or just stand back and I'll do what I'm thinking. But I mean,
That's an enticing choice.
well, yeah, but I don't. Yeah. So, all right. So
I want to hear the open-ended response. That's what's
yeah,
interesting to me.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, I think the conclusion that I eventually came to about where Corbin stands is that he is a a extremely liberal post-Islamic creative theologian. Post-Islamic because he doesn't believe in the incarnation. I mean, so you don't have that problem because you're at the you don't have the Jesus problem because you're at the intersection of Judaism and Buddhism. So you're in pretty good shape, at least from Corbin's point of view, because look what you do have. You got the book. You don't have God in the flesh, and that's a whole other set of problems. And Corbin has his response to that, but it's not as generous as his response to the Judaic tradition, because he just says, Jesus is just not God. Jesus is an angel. So this whole incarnation thing is just bullshit. And so, basically 1,500 years of Christian history is just wrong. And that's a lot for most Christians to deal with. Not all, but many. But the Jews don't have that problem. They have the book, and Corbin loves books, because
but he doesn't love rationalism, and he doesn't love dogmatic abstract monotheism.
No, he doesn't. But what he does love is the rabbinical tradition. He loves interpreting. What he hates is stopping. And what he doesn't like is, well, laws. He doesn't like laws. On the other hand, as even if push came to shove, Corbin would say, well, yeah, there are the 10 Commandments, but there's this more important stuff, which is much more exciting. But he can't, in all good conscience, deny the literal meaning of the book. William Chittick, who knew Corbin well and has critical things to say about him as a scholar, says, look, in one of the footnotes to his first book on Ibn Arabi, Chittick says that in his opinion, Corbin got entranced by the imaginal and the world of multiplicity and diversity, and that's where he kind of gets too extreme. But, Chittick says, he couldn't give up the idea of unity and law and the literal meaning of the book without completely vitiating his Islamic I was going to say faith, but no, without completely vitiating the meaning of the text. And then the same would immediately apply to the tradition of the Old Testament. And that may be true, but where Corbin's heart lies. His heart lies with Kidir, with the mysterious stranger in Shura 18, because he's the one that says to Moses, yeah, but not quite. The laws, the laws are good, but once you're really there, then you realize that the laws are like Wittgenstein's ladder. You climb it, and then when you're up there, you throw it away. You don't have to worry about it. But even Corbin would have to. But Corbin says, that he some of the stuff that he's dealing with during his time in Paris is the rise of Marxist thought, and he says that rather than looking for a permanent revolution, what we should look for is a permanent hermeneutic. Okay, but in order to have a hermeneutic, you've got to have a text. You can't have nothing. David Abram, and this comes from a different direction, and maybe many of you may not know this book, but David Abram is an ecologist and a philosopher, and also Jewish. And he makes the comment, and others have too, but this is where I learned about it. He points out that in the original Hebrew and in the original Arabic, they didn't write down the vowels. You had to guess.
This big deal.
And only later on did they put all the little doohickeys in there so you know how you're supposed to pronounce it. So that, first of all, reading becomes really hard. You have to pronounce all the consonants. And then you have to guess by context what the word is. I mean, God's word, to American Christians of the 20th century, so many of them think that it's easy to take the word of God literally. And Corbin and Abram and anyone who knows those ancient languages knows that, not so much. It's not always entirely sure. You're not always entirely clear what exactly God meant when he said, well, it was either, a camel or it had something to do with a well. It's not quite, it depends on what vowel you put in there. And Corbin says that's the whole thing. You are looking, the whole history, he says, of the traditions of the book is the search for the lost speech. And if you think you have found it, you're screwed, because what is there perpetually is this perpetual hermeneutics. And if that, so it's in Hillman's phraseology, he's arguing for the poetic basis of mind, although more than that, he's arguing for the poetic basis of creation. And from Corbin's point of view, this is, as he puts it somewhere, a Gothic style of cosmology. That is, it is never finished. And he loves what he takes to be one of the key ideas of the Zoroastrians, whether they actually believe this or not, I have no idea. He says, for one of those traditions is the Zoroastrian religion, every being of light has an angel. Even the supreme being has an angel. Otherwise, he'd think he was God. And bang, the whole thing would just collapse in a big nothing. Even the supreme being has an angel out ahead to keep the whole thing moving. Otherwise, poets would write, a poem and say, well, that's it, I'm done. This is what happened to Hegel, He wrote, that's it, the end of history thing. Yeah, we got the whole thing, no point, and may as well. And Corbin is saying, no. It's all about perpetual creativity, perpetual hermeneutics. There is always something new to appear. As soon as you think you've got the truth, what's he say? The path of the philosopher, is I never remember the quote, but to be on the road. The path of the philosopher is to be on the road in search of the light, and the light is always receding. There is no end to these discoveries. And so that's why he's a post-Islamic Christian, because he just pulls the rug out of Jesus. He's got Jesus as being one in an endless series of prophets. It's why he loves the Shiite notion of the hidden imam, because if your imam becomes unhidden, then you've got the Jesus problem again. It's like, because the imam will start telling you things which, since he is the imam, must be the truth, and it must be truth with a capital T, and you're done. nobody else can have anything to say. And Corbin's all about the perpetual speaking. He quotes Schleiermacher in one of those late essays. He says Schleiermacher had it right when he said, in a perfect world, anybody could write a Bible if what they wrote had the sufficient power. You know, Schleiermacher says there can be new Bibles, and Corbin very approvingly, quotes Schleiermacher, and he says, Corbin is clearly thinking of the Quran, and then the question that arises for all of us in the 21st century is, well, what about the Book of Mormon? Or what about William Blake's Jerusalem? Or what about Charles Olson's Maximus poems? What about Norman O. Brown throws Finnegan's Wake in the mess? If you haven't read Norman O. Brown's essay on the Quran and Finnegan's Wake, he says the Quran is more avant-garde than Finnegan's Wake, and it's constructed in the same way. It's fascinating article. Corbin, and so one of the real questions, and it's an open question, and I don't think it's answerable, is what would Corbin say about Blake's Jerusalem or the book? Well, no, I was going to say about the Book of Mormon. He was perfectly happy with the Mormons. He gets really enthusiastic about the Mormons because of the whole angel thing. He only mentions it once briefly somewhere, but he says, "Yeah, Mormons, I'm into that. They got their angels. It's fantastic. New book. We're right with that." But then the question is, one of the American poets who got so enthusiastic about Corbin was, in fact, Charles Olson, and he took Corbin and the Imaginal really seriously. And one of the commentators on Olson's work says you cannot read the Maximus poems unless you understand it as being the world of Herculia, the eighth climb. If you read the Maximus poems, which are set in Gloucester, Massachusetts, if you don't read them as if it was the Imaginal, you'll never understand Olson. I've always had a little trouble with that. Blake's got London, and that's okay. That's okay. But Gloucester, Massachusetts, man, I mean, how secular can you get before you lose the connection? I mean, what counts and what doesn't? So there is always, you see what's wonderful about Corbin and what makes it, Corbin is beautiful because he shows you what pissed off the Pope so much about Luther. Pope looks at Luther and says, man, if you do that, what's going to happen. And it did. How many Protestant sects are there? I mean, there's just a countless number of them. And Corbin's kind of saying, that's okay. But then, Corbin's notion of what counts as religion, in the end, my suspicion, and here I'll finish this way because you kind of see that I'm trying to answer your question, but the place where it becomes difficult with Corbin in particular is that he was pissed off at Hillman and David Miller. He was very nervous, and you can see that in the introduction to the fifth printing of Spiritual Body, and the prelude or whatever it is to Spiritual Body. He says, we have seen with some concern, not mixed with consternation, the way he never mentions Hillman and never mentions other people at Aranos, but he's clearly a little worried about what Hillman's doing with the idea of the imaginal. And he says, I wish I could quote it, I've got it here somewhere, but he says, we're concerned, he says, because if you take this imaginal realm and you rip it out of its Iranian context, then, all sorts of bad things can happen. You can get the macabre and the absurd, and he pretty clearly wasn't into 20th century art. He was into, he says in that same passage, he says the hieratic art of the Persians is serious and subdued. And he says, basically, I don't like what Hillman's doing with this idea here of polytheism, because my polytheism is poly, but not that poly. and so as in another anecdote, which puts the same point, if he were sitting here, you'd have, these are the questions you would say. It's like, okay, Henri, you've got this. You brought us this gift from Persia, and look what's happened. It's gone crazy. And he's saying, yeah, they shouldn't have done that. And you'd have to ask him, well, how do you know the limits? And what he would say. He'd say, well, you have to go deep inside, and you'd have to know. He'd go all Gnostic on you. But precisely because, and these are the critiques of this kind of religion, precisely because he refuses to explicitly anchor his religion in particular what do you call it, liturgies and particular creeds. Because you can tell he's nervous about that, because he wants to be more welcoming. And so these are the issues that some of the traditionalists, addressed. I think in the end, Corbin he did not count himself among the traditionalists. He was a little nervous about them because so many of them had this fundamentalist streak in them that you can just feel him kind of, that's not quite right. Kathleen Rain, who knew Corbin really well, she's the Temenos person, one of her essays, she says, my friends, the traditionalists, she says, I don't think they really understand the freedom of the imagination, and they make me a little nervous. She says, the person who I follow is Henry Corbin, who seems to, but, you see what happens. You still, and this is religion. This is, you want to find a path to trod, and Corbin is basically saying you have to find your own path, but then you have to say, well, how will I be sure? And Corbin's almost saying maybe you won't, and that's like really Buddhist. In my little internal version of Buddhist, that you can't be looking for certainty, you just have to keep looking. And that's why I love Corbin, and that's why I love what Hillman does with it, because it always leaves you with a little bit of doubt. And if it weren't for that doubt, that's also central to his theology, and he kind of points at that when he talks in the Cyclical Time essay. It's a little doubt in the supreme being that gives birth to the universe and to Ahriman and everything. So the story is somewhere it's in Cyclical Time, and he does it in just a sentence or two, although it happens twice in that essay. So the supreme being is sitting around thinking, wow, I'm pretty supreme and I'm pretty real. And then he thinks, what if I'm not? The whole universe just blows right up. And then that's the birth of Ahriman and all the angels, and so for Corbin and for the Zoroastrians, it's like, that's like a really powerful thing. And if you don't have that essential, permanent doubt, then you'll freeze solid, There, how's that for an answer?
And I'm sorry, just to close out that question, then so that makes us pretty clear on where Corbin departs from the traditionalists. Then where does he stop short? Where someone like the Theosophists or the Baha'i or...
No, that's the question. And to which I do not have an answer. I think you just got to go all Gnostic. You just have to say, you have to give him credit, and you just, and it's not philosophically or even theologically reassuring, and it raises all sorts of. This is why he's not a social or political philosopher, right? Because it ends up being an individual decision. On the other hand, he does take Ahriman and evil profoundly seriously, and to the point where Corbin's God is not really omnipotent. Corbin's God needs all the Fravartis and all the beings of light to fight this battle for the soul of the world. So he has limits, but he is reluctant, at least in his written work, right? And there's there's where we really would like some serious biographical work from people who knew him. He didn't see it, and this makes sense of how I understand his personality. It's not his job to lay down laws for other people. It's his job to do just the opposite. There's enough laws, But this has always been a real question for me as to how to interpret his theology to be more than a theology of the individual. And I think it can be done, but and the way you do it is first of all to focus on the dualitude and the inherent necessity for pluralism. So in order for God's creation to be maximally or sufficiently real, God's infinite. So there's got to be an infinite number of religions or, whatevers. That's the paradox of monotheism. There can't be one religion. But there is, if you wanted to make a social theology out of Corbin, and it's easy, as with Jung, it's easy to go overboard in the direction of individuation. Corbin, and maybe Jung, I don't want to think about it now, Corbin is saved from that to some extent by the fact that what you meet when you individuate is somebody else. That is to say, it's your angel who makes you realize that the ego that you are so desirous of defending is completely irrelevant. There's a phrase somewhere in the Avicenna book where he says, the eternal individuality of you has nothing to do with the ego and the person that you think you are. So that blows that apart. And then because all the energies of creation are based on love, that gets you connection too. But for years, I spent a long time trying to make to understand Corbin's theology in a way that would be suitably communitarian, and I think you can. But it's easy. It would be easy not to.
I wonder, Tom, you talked about hermeneutic and the text, and I wonder if, the idea of hermeneutics and Tawil might be sort of an anchor that, would sort of draw some constraints, to make this distinction. If you look at historical examples of Tawil, like they can be all over the place, or even, look at in Persian culture, like Rumi or Hafiz, which are considered sort of their diwans or like second Qur'ans, and they contradict in some ways the limits of the law and the letter of the text, but, they have that reference. And even Blake and the Book of Mormon are not Orthodox New Testament or Byzantine Church Christianity, but they have that anchoring and that respect for the text. And I wonder if that might be sort of part of the function of Tawil, is to say, well, there's an anchor somewhere. It's connected back to the divine book, something like that.
I think that's completely right. I'm as sure as I can be that Corbin would have said, yeah, that's exactly right. But the question in practice, unless you're Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Zoroastrian or Mormon, if you are, well, that's what Nasser and some of those people were saying. You got to pick a tradition. You don't just get to float around in California and be vaguely spiritual. You got to pick one. And the reason would be, you got to have a book. You can do what you want with it, but you got to have the damn book. Otherwise, what? Otherwise, I'm not necessarily agreeing with that. Although the older I get, the more attractive that seems. You got to work from some text. I mean, I've been thinking about Corbin and the American poets on and off now for several years, and they're always responding to other poets, and so in a very real sense, if you pay this is actually an important thing to say, maybe in this context. No matter how free you think you are being, either artistically or spiritually, you are responding to something. You are in a lineage. It might be, over the course of time, it might be kind of incoherent, but you're responding to some lineage. The literary critic, George Steiner, has in a book that everybody who's interested in Corbin should read. You should read lots of Steiner, but and not Rudolph, George. I don't know. I don't have opinions about Rudolph. What's it called? Not the Grammars of Creation. The one before that. Oh man. Anyway, it's about art, and it begins with a beautiful idea. He says there shouldn't be any art criticism. He says in the best possible world, there would be no critics of art or critics of literature. There would only be writers and artists, and their works would be the best commentaries on the works that they were responding to, because every artist is always responding to someone who came before. And I thought, wow, that's profound. And that's precisely what Corbin means by hermeneutic. And because Corbin's sense of hermeneutic is very, very broad. And so is as with Tawil, so from this point of view, you could say there is only hermeneutics, because you are, whatever you're thinking. This may be, oh, well, actually, it might be a point worth making. What's the opposite of hermeneutics? It's literalism. What's the opposite of creatively living? It's habit, or listening to Fox News in the States here. Listen to somebody else to find out what it is that you think, because it's so much easier to be institutionalized than it is to be creative. What do I think? Read the book. What do I think? Listen to Jerry Falwell. What do I think? Listen to the Pope. All these people artists, Corbin, they're all saying, yeah, how about you listen to the Pope and then think about it, you know? Or one of the great things that has helped me understand Corbin's notion of language is Ivan Illich's In the Vineyard of the Text, where he points out that in the 12th century, you know, the text of the Bible had no paragraphs, had no periods, had no chapters, had no punctuation, had nothing. And so if you were going to read it, you had to read it out loud. And so all these monks sitting in their little monasteries would all be mumbling, and they were called mumblers. And in fact, as Illich likes to point out,
it's still like that in the yeshiva.
Bernard of Clairvaux or somebody says, you should get exercise. You should either go play ball, go play basketball, or you could read, because that is an incredibly difficult, and you engage your brain and your tongue and your breath and your mind, and we call that lectio divina. That is what Corbin has got in the back of his mind when he says hermeneutics. And footnote, it's also probably what Martin Heidegger had in the back of his mind when he said hermeneutics is the best way of understanding Dasein. So it's a very broad notion of what constitutes understanding and what constitutes reading and what constitutes living. And just because I'm on a roll here, what Charles Olson, the American poet, was trying to resurrect and was enthusiastic about Corbin because of was very much that kind of reading and engagement with a text. And that's one of the reasons he was in, so there were plenty of poets who were right there. And so just to reiterate the point that you made, the text is what constrains you. I'm going to steal that because I've been thinking, I've been thinking a lot recently about my tendency to think of the imagination as freedom and lack of constraint. And that's not right. It's partly right. But if Corbin is right, and Ibn Arabi is right, and Shiravardi is right, then the imagination is stuff too. And Gaston Bachelard, all the alchemical stuff. If you're so the freedom and the constraint, when I tend to think that way about the imagination, and I am really bothered by the fact that I tend to bifurcate things that way, and I kind of wish I'm too old to do it, but I have the intuition that Alfred North Whitehead knew about this problem and was trying to figure out a cosmology to solve it. So that you didn't think of creativity on the one hand and dead matter on the other. So that, and I think that's what, there's another thing. There's a point I want to make. You guys have been deep into this book. It has occurred to me in the last couple of years that Corbin does himself a disservice when he articulates the positioning of the imaginal realm between the sensible and the intellectual. And this is subtle, and I don't really, I'd have to write it in order to be really careful about it. And I haven't yet. But if you're not careful about that distinction, let me put it really baldly. That falls into the trap of British empiricism and Locke, and maybe Kant, although maybe not Kant, but certainly British empiricism. He explicitly says, well, you got sensible matter down here, and then you got the intellect up here, and imagination's everything in the middle. And that's not helpful, and it seems to me that if Corbin had lived long enough, he might have read Whitehead and maybe Gilles Deleuze, and he would have said, oh, that's not very helpful to think of. I'm still thinking in pre-critical terms here of matter and intellect. And what I'm really arguing for is something that makes both of those categories nonsensical. And he keeps doing it. And maybe he gets it from Ibn Arabi. I don't know where he gets it, but he does that. And it's not really very helpful. What he needs to say instead is, and this is philosophically nonsense, but what he needs, unless you're very careful, what he needs to say instead is what I say, which is it's all imagination. Some of it's a little lumpy, and some of it is a little what's the word? Subtle, but it's all subtle. It's all subtle bodies. So that if you make the jump from a sense of literal materiality and you say, as Corbin almost says, and certainly lived as if he meant, it's all subtle bodies. If you ever encounter sense matter, then you've fallen in with the British empiricists and you should leave, because it's all subtle bodies. And the subtler they get, the realer they get. And you see, yeah. I think he starts a couple of books with that tripartite cosmology, and I've don't do that anymore. Read Deleuze or somebody, who doesn't do that. And then Corbin slips in beautifully. Maybe you know about this, and maybe you need to if you don't. There's a book about Gilles Deleuze by a guy named Peter Hayward. The only reason I know about Hayward's book is that every now and then I'll Google search Henry Corbin and look for books in which his name shows up. His name shows up only 2 or 3 times in Hayward's book, which is called something, I forget, Beyond Something. Hayward is attacking Gilles Deleuze, but in the process of, no, he's not attacking him, he's saying, no, he's got it all wrong. But he says, actually, Deleuze is very much like a handful of others in the 20th century who were philosophers of, not transcendence, not immanence, but philosophers of something. And he names Corbin, Christian Jambet, and a couple other French philosophers whose names escape me. And Hayward says, oh, well, Deleuze is like those guys. And I thought, oh man, in some other life, I'd have to read Deleuze and see what Hayward means, because he thinks that Gilles Deleuze is doing, in many respects, the same thing that Corbin was doing, which is interesting because there was a lot of really wacky stuff going on in Paris in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And a lot of these people kind of knew each other. Even though Corbin was off, in Tehran and Ascona, he has to have crossed paths with some of these people. You see what happens when I find a captive audience. Also, one of the most important footnotes, he said authoritatively, is in this book, is his reference to Etienne Souriau. And the reason I mention that is because those of you who are young scholars who want to go down the Corbin rabbit hole, Etienne Souriau was really important for Corbin. And he also turns out to be really important for Bruno Latour and Isabel Stengers, who have just sponsored a translation of one of the books that Corbin quotes from here. And of course, Latour and Stengers are off in another realm of, the complex systems theory and critiques of science, but it is pertinent because Corbin takes the term the angel of the work, and from Souriau, and he also, one of the other terms, the angelic function of beings. He gets that term, which I love and have used many times. He gets that from Suryo. And if you read some Suryo, it gives a whole new meaning to what those terms, the affordances of those terms. When Corbin uses terms, you know, you're in Corbin world, which is, Lord knows, marvelous and wonderful and infinite and perfectly inhabitable. And if you want to live there the rest of your life, that would be fantastic. But if you just turn him a little bit, you're in a whole different world where the terms are all still there, but you're now making connections that you hadn't made before. It's infinite, this stuff, this Corbin stuff. I don't know why it is. Hadi Fakhouri says it's because Corbin was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, and he might be right. He certainly hits, you know, half a dozen or a dozen themes that are just utterly central to what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. And he plays those notes in ways that are really, really useful, and then you can go play with them on your own. That was a thing I just said.
All right, wonderful. I think we could grab a question from Mackenzie now, and then make sure Rodrigo and Esme have a chance to pick your mind a little bit after that. So.
So before I ask my question, I just wanted to say I'm really glad you brought up the connection with Mormons in the previous answer, because I was actually raised in the Mormon tradition. So I was like, oh, there you go, I'm familiar. And, you know, it's very interesting. I've thought a lot about it. And so right around the end of high school, I left it behind. And that was when I got into Buddhism. And I've actually been considering going back potentially. So I was wondering if you had a reference for the Corbin commentary on Mormons, because I didn't know he had talked about Mormons.
It's real short.
Yeah.
Send me an email and I'll find it for you. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. So the question I wanted to ask, one thing that came up towards the end of Alone with the Alone was this passage where Corbin talks about lived psychic time. You know, as kind of distinguishing that from like objective quantitative time. Right. You know, like making this differentiation between them, and he's commenting on something in Ibn Arabi when he does that. And so the question I want to ask is really broad, which is just, and I kind of want to ask it in two ways. The first way is, from your point of view, what's Corbin's sort of understanding of the relationship between imagination and time? Ooh. And then, I know.
Part two?
Yeah. And then perhaps part two is from your own personal point of view. So like, from, you know, what you perceive Corbin's view to be versus what you perceive your view to be. And obviously I know time-wise, you can choose one or the other if you want. Whichever you think would be easier.
That's Boof.
I apologize ahead of time.
Well, boy, because it's not just time; it's space too. I mean, we're good post-Einsteinians, and so you really can't. So they are not distinct issues, and I'm gonna talk around it a bit because I don't have. I mean, for myself, I don't have a particularly good answer, but I have little inroads, which is that's about all you can get, at least unless you have a full-blown mystical experience. And if you've had one, you know, more power to you. I mean, just a footnote to my own approach is that I attract a certain kind of student who I think is, like, in many aspects, often way beyond my experiences. People who have had mystical transports of one sort or another. And I'm actually pretty grounded, except for psychotic breaks long ago. And so I'm really interested in exploring the immediate phenomenal experiences. I mean, Corbin flies off to heaven and he leaves me behind. But when he does that, he goes through the looking glass. And I'm still there, putting my hand through, thinking, ooh, that's cool. And I kind of want to stay here. I don't want to leave. And so this space and time stuff, if it's not immediate, I think that in order to answer the space and time questions in the most interesting ways, we don't have language for it. And most of us, including me, only have the glimmerings of the experience, although you can find plenty of people who claim to have, and you should listen to them. I'm not one of them. Who have, altered whatevers in many ways. The Corbin's point of view, I have no doubt that it's in one of my books somewhere. Is the little anecdote that Darius Shagan tells about Corbin at the music room of Ali Kapoor, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, and Corbin, which has all these cutout images of vases and things, and Corbin puts his hand through the opening and says, "This is the phenomenon of the mirror. The vase is elsewhere." I don't have that much, okay? But Corbin had that. He had an experience of the world as an icon. He had it in the immediate. My goal in life, I don't mean that. One of my intentions, and this is in response to the space aspect of your question, but as we've already said, it's deeply tied to the time aspect. So I hope this doesn't come as a shock, because I have to figure out, it won't, but I have to figure out how to articulate it right. So I'm a biologist. And I've been, a biologist for 30, 40 years. And the kind of biology that I'm most attracted to is little tiny things. I stared through a microscope for a living for 40 years, and I love that. And every time I see an insect or a small thing or a leaf, I don't know, it's imagination or something, but I know what's in there. And it's not a mystical experience, but when and I can certainly I can go out in the garden and pick zucchini without having that experience, but there's a certain kind of natural history or astronomy or geology or botany, or I would argue sociology or history. What about, what if you see, you're an archaeologist and you run across a spoon, and all of a sudden the world just opens out. See, I think that's the beginning of what Corbin's talking about. And he's saying, you see, everything is infinite. What I want to, I want to stay there. I want, people who read Corbin not to run away to heaven, you know, and not to get so entranced with the imagination that they forget that you're in it now. You know, you are never not in the imagination except when you're doing something completely out of habit or completely automatic. And then you know immediately what happens. Your brain starts doing things and you're off in the imagination again. And then here's where one of those difficult questions comes. Some of that is fantasy, daydreaming, kind of useless. Well, no, I mean, I want to give it real meaning. You know, I want to give it, and all that, even the useless daydreaming, and oh, there's this beautiful woman, and oh, that guy reminds me of my father, and you know, even that stuff. It's like bubbling up, and if you're a poet, you know, you just take that stuff, and you do things with it, and you interact with it really consciously. So, I mean, look, the psychic alterations of time and space are going on all the time. You know, I mean, they just are. There's a great story about, what was it? Indigenous peoples in the Americas are aware of the fact that each, or at least used to be before they got overrun with capitalism, that each individual group was running on its own time, you know. And when they there's a story somewhere, and I can't remember where it is, maybe it's what's his name who tells it. When they came together, they had to check up and like, you know, where are, you know, because it's pretty clear that you're living in a different. So here's another way in which the small scale alterations in space and time are ubiquitous. So one of you is a neuroscientist, Anil Seth. I think Anil Seth says, on the basis of studying people with, you know, drug experiences, I think it's Anil Seth. He says, you know, and just do this mind game, which is impossible, but you get the idea. If you could suddenly drop down your consciousness in somebody else's sensorium, you would be really stoned. You would be like, whoa, this is weird. You know, oh, Jesus, this person has a pain in their hip and they don't see well and their fingers are numb and they see red much brighter than I do. And oh my God, they got these horrible memories of their mother. And oh my God, you wouldn't be able to handle it. You know, everybody's got a different space and time and experiences and body sensoria and you know, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And in order to cope with that, we make clocks and rulers, and amazingly they work. You know, the quantum mechanics people notwithstanding, but for the most part, you know, clocks and rulers work. But in some other universe, maybe C.S. Lewis's Paralandra, you know, everybody knows that everybody's experience is different. And when you go meet a new person, you have to spend a whole lot of time to figure out, what if we didn't live in a world of global capitalism, and every time you met, you know, you're the Yanomami, and meeting the Englishman for the first time, it's like, whoa, this is weird. And you know, you're both people, but you're not communicating. And those of you who do different languages, see, that's the thing. That's where, you know, I'm constitutionally incapable of believing that, and I'll get in trouble because there are people here that speak Mandarin, that things that different languages provide different affordances for you. I know that geology provides different affordances than biology, and that's got to be true for Mandarin and Urdu. You know, it's just got to be. Maybe you can.
I'm not really sure that I speak Mandarin. I mean, I perform that I speak Mandarin.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating.
But within that, there is no question, right, that different, you know, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right, that different languages structure cognition differently. You can experience that for yourself.
Yeah, okay. It seems like it must be true. I mean, this is a silly little footnote, but I have a reasonably close relative. He's a young guy who now speaks Mandarin fluently. He lives in China. And I saw him for the first time in many years, just a couple of years ago, and he had a friend with him, and she was, oh gosh, she was of dual Turkish-Japanese citizenship, and she spoke Turkish, Japanese, Mandarin, and English. And I thought, man, that's got to be weird. And they were talking together in Mandarin, and all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, they're laughing in Chinese, because they were laughing in Chinese. And when you switch it over to English, you laugh differently. And I thought, there it is. That's it. That is really cool. That's why I want to come back as a linguist. And it's, you know, it's one of the things that underlies Corbin's experience of all this stuff. You know, Greek and Latin and Spanish and Arabic and Persian, little Turkish, Russian, Swedish, German, really well German. You know, I mean, and he's so much into hermeneutics. I haven't ever seen him talk. Do you know, because some of you read my first book, that his copy of Being in Time is glossed in Arabic. And I checked with Hadi Fakhuri. I said, Hadi, it's got to be Arabic and Persian, right? And he said, yeah, I've seen it. And it's in Arabic and Persian. Because he's reading Being in Time in 1930 when he's also reading Shuravarti. And so Heidegger's talking about hermeneutics, and Shuravarti's talking about hermeneutics. And so Corbin's reading Being in Time, and he's writing down Arabic and Persian terms, and he's thinking, wow, this is great. This is really great. Problem with Heidegger is he's got this Sein zum Tod thing. And if it weren't for that, you know, he'd have been really in there. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the comparative spiritual hermeneutics of these languages, which is sadly way out of my league.
Very interesting stuff. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Shall we head over to Esme now? It's getting late where you're at, so I'll give you the spot here now.
I knew this would happen. That's fine. Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. You gotta unmute yourself.
Yeah, I don't know. I think is that all good? Do you hear me?
Gotcha.
So this is a very minor detail, and the uncanny thing is Corbin only actually mentions it once, I think, in the book, and it feels like quite ontologically significant. So that is uncanny to me, which is why I wanted to bring it up. So I can't remember exactly which chapter it is, but he makes a distinction between two aspects of the imagination, namely the khayal mutasil and then the khayal munfasil. And the former of those, I believe, is an imagination which is somehow conjoined to the sensory. And then the other imagination is more attuned to what I would understand as the Platonic forms. It's a much more pure, uncorrupted imagination. And this does make a lot of sense. And I think it could also potentially solve the problem of, is the imagination this sort of fantasy dream world? Because, you know, you can use the imagination for all sorts of, you know, quite sort of things related to the animal soul. But then, of course, you can also use the imagination as a Gnostic tool, as a theurgical tool, even in terms of becoming to know God and becoming one with the divine. So I think it's really important he makes this distinction, but also strange that he only really gives it attention on one occasion. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any elaborations on these two aspects of the imagination, either as a scholar or just personally, what are your
Well,
thoughts?
Personally, first, I override that distinction all the time because I don't like it. or I prefer to see the two aspects as being continuous.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, for all the I hope in support of the kinds of arguments I've been making already about time and space. I'm suspicious of a discontinuity because I want to go there. You know, so I'm a little because of my own personal proclivities. There's got to be more. There's got to be more of an explanation than that, and I'll get to the other part of the thing in a minute. Yeah, it just seems like this. I'm suspicious of. I think he gets that from Ibn Arabi.
Yeah.
I think he says that's where it comes from. So Lord knows I'm now going to tell Ibn Arabi he was wrong. Yeah, right. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm suspicious. I mean, if it's a distinction, that's fine. You know, and for Corbin, you got a light face and a dark face, and when the dark face is facing down here, that would be the conjoined imagination, and when you're facing there would be the unconjoined imagination. That's okay. I mean, there's no reason for me to say that doesn't happen. But I guess constitutionally, I'm really interested in the. Yeah, I'm just most interested in the switch from one to the other because it's in making transitions that you realize there's a distinction. You know, you can't make a distinction unless you've been to both places. And speaking autobiographically, that was my interpretation of my experience of my Jungian experience being in a complex and out of a complex. When you're in a complex, it is reality. And when you're out of it, you think, whoa, I'm out of that. And then you go back in and you come out and you go back in. And in my experience, it's like 30 years. And then you finally, when you're in it, you say, aha, aha, this is not all of reality. And I know there's another side to this. And then, so I am really interested in those transitions. And that one in particular. You know, the dumb, stupid imagination, the animal imagination versus the one that most people seem interested in, which is union with your angel and God and all that. My problem is I want that here. And I think Corbin had it here. In one of the places, I think you're exactly right, Esme, that there's very little in this book, at least, which is a throwaway. If he puts something in here, it's really important, and it's not. I don't think it's here, but in one of his books, he briefly talks about wanting to unite, and this is a paraphrase, so it may be pretty wrong, but it's what he means. To unite a theological sense of transcendence with the Greek sense of beauty. And he's talking about that in a context which could be physical love. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I don't know anything about Corbin and Stella's sex life, but I think, you know, and they didn't have any kids, but that didn't mean anything. But I think Corbin experienced the world erotically. You know, like Bernini's, or whoever did St. Teresa. You know, I think Corbin would say, yeah, maybe that's a little much, but that's my experience of reality. Is that it's a sensuous. It's incredible. Nothing, it's all. If you know Merleau-Ponty, before he got hit by the truck, he was thinking about flesh, the flesh of the world. There's a lot in late Merleau-Ponty which feels a lot like Corbin. They're both in Paris at the same time. They're both French. They like women, they like wine, they like the world, and they're both thinking about the sensuous reality of the world. And you see, when you make a distinction between the animal imagination or the merely conjoined imagination, and then the free imagination, that seems to me to not get you where you want to go, which is the Greek sense of beauty. Like Rilke. Corbin says a couple of times that Rilke's angels were what Islam means by angels, which is patently untrue, but it's what Corbin interprets the Islamic angels. He says, Rilke in the elegies, that's it. Now, if you read Rilke's elegies over and over and over again, you just end up being in this world of incredible sensuality where time and space and matter are all like really weird. I think that's what Corbin is after. And then just one more thing about the conjoined imagination. Is it in this book? No, it's in the Spiritual Body. I think it's in a footnote, which is where most of the really interesting things happen in Corbin. Never miss the footnotes. He says, certain traditions say that animals can see things that only in the human world, only the most advanced mystics can see. So, so much for the animal imagination. Somebody says to Corbin, oh yeah, no, the animals, they're there, man. They know what it's like. Who is it, Bataille or somebody says the animal is in the world like water in water. And that would be like subtle body cranked up, So as I was suggesting that we not take Corbin's tripartite cosmology too literally for that reason, that it distinguishes the senses and the intellect from the imagination, that if you do what Ibn Arabi says we should, which is to distinguish the conjoined imagination from the unconjoined imagination, then you risk doing exactly what Corbin says the history of Western philosophy did, which is to set the imagination off as this special thing and then set it aside, and then you get intellect and you get sensation, and then that's not, it's just the opposite of what he wants us to do, I think.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of what I want to make him do.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you so much. I think I'm actually going to head out now because it is getting quite late here.
Yeah,
and I've
bye.
got back tomorrow. But it was so great. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. And I'd really like to keep in touch, in terms of your work.
If you send, okay, so here's something that's self-serving. If you send me your emails, I will put you on my newsletter list and you'll know what I'm doing.
That would be great. I'll tell you what, I'll do that now before I
Okay.
head out.
On occasion, when I have time, I send out a newsletter.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Okay, I think that's my email. I'm very sleepy now.
Okay. Bye. Go to sleep. Go to sleep.
No, I'm sorry. I would love to stay longer. But yeah, thank you so much. And it's lovely to see you all and hear about your takes on everything. So yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Esme. Bye. All right. Yeah. I liked the erotic that was just brought up. We had some interesting discussions some week about the Greek divides of some of these terms, and I sort of got it in my head that Corbin's doing erosophy or something like that.
Yeah. I think so. His whole Sophia thing. Mm-hmm. I think you have to take that pretty seriously in a fleshy sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, because again, if you know Merleau-Ponty's stuff on the flesh, I mean, it is erotic and it isn't erotic. It's years ago in the 70s, Susan Griffin wrote a book called The Eros of Everyday Life, which is getting very much the same kind of thing. One of the things that annoys me terribly about my focus on Corbin, Hillman, and Jung, which I didn't have any control over, is that there's so few women in this in the story, and so I'm trying to rectify that as I teach now. My long-standing and perhaps false explanation for that is that it's the guys who tend to have the problems that Corbin and Jung and Hillman address. And so, you know, I read a lot of these feminist philosophers, and they weren't speaking to me because I think I wasn't far enough along yet. You know, maybe that's wrong. And of course, you know, genders are complicated. But I think I needed to read these guys because they were addressing problems that I had in ways that other people who happen to be women were not. Now, well, and there's this incredible explosion of relevant literature now. Once you're out into this realm of Eros and the world, you'll find plenty of women writing so well about it, and with perspectives that these guys don't have. I don't have to make those arguments now. But yeah, there's a yeah, and neuroscientists are doing it. I love Carhart Harris's stuff. I did a talk once on what was it, the default mode network. You know, what the imagination does is it breaks up the default mode network. And then so there's that literature's going on, and then the other place that I would go if I were, you know, 30 years younger is the literature in anthropology. The anthropologists, some of the best ones. So here's a good story. So who are these people? The guy that wrote How Forests Think, Eduardo Cohn, and then another one of my favorite people, whose name I'm going to forget, but she's I'm going to forget her name, but she's in Toronto, I think, and she wrote a big book on the biological imagination. Anyway, so they're both thinking really seriously about how the imagination works, whether they're using those terms or not. And then, you know, they both have to get their PhDs and they have to get tenure, and so they keep writing in the standard form. But then if you look at their CVs, you find that they're working in their spare time with artists and people in the theater, and they're working with poets and painters, because that's where all this stuff goes. And so it's pretty exciting, because there's a lot of people working this kind of territory in the sciences, in all the best work, he said, all the best work in all of the academic disciplines has relevance for these ways of opening things up. At least it seems that way to me. And that was not the case when I was an undergraduate in philosophy. Let me tell you, it was not the case.
It's interesting you mentioned Carhart Harris. He's really influential, like especially for me. He's this whole thing, the entropic brain hypothesis in relationship to, you know, like especially psychedelics, a lot of the research he's done there. But like for like my current work right now, my thesis is actually like looking at brain entropy and how brain entropy differs while people are engaged in certain tasks. And so like for the project I'm doing, it's memory tasks. So like, how does brain entropy differ between when you're like creating a memory versus how it differs when you're recalling a memory, you know, and that kind of a thing. So it's all fascinating.
So here's, we should do this again sometime. So here's a little bit of autobiography. 91, 92, Varela and Thompson and Eleanor Roche published The Embodied Mind. And I just thought, oh my God, this is fantastic. Same time, same months, I discover Hillman. And I was like, oh no. And I'm, I was trying to escape being a theoretical biologist and being, really theoretical, really scientific. I loved it. It was very imaginative, but I spent an agonizing year. Okay, it's going to be Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and Buddhism, and Heidegger, and weird neuroscience, or it's going to be Hillman, and then soon Corbin. And Hillman and Corbin won. And then, just a year or two ago, what the hell? Something happened. I don't remember what it was that drew my attention back. And I think they just published the reissue of The Embodied Mind. Something drew me back into the neuroscience stuff. And my original reaction was, oh no, I can't do that because it's bad for my soul. And then I realized, oh, I don't have that problem anymore. And the problem was the reductionist mindset, that I would just click and be a Darwinian again, clickety, 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 clickety. And you don't ever have to think because you've got natural selection and that's all you pretty soon you're Richard Dawkins. And it's very scary. And I realized I don't have that. Hillman and Corbin cured me. I don't have that anymore. So now I can be a scientist again. Now I can be a real scientist who knows that these are all models and that it's always hypothetical. I mean, that's another way to read, not so much Corbin, though you can, but it's a way to read Hillman. Or it's a way to be Zoroastrian and say, yeah, doubt, just a little bit of doubt, you recognize that everything's hypothetical and wham, you are gifted the entire universe. As long as you remember about the hypothetical part. So as long as you don't take your brain scans too literally, oh God, that stuff is so great. Anyway, is there other questions? Are there other questions before
Rodrigo,
I completely...
do you have anything to contribute?
No, that's fine. I think a lot was answered, and I have to get going now. But I'm glad that you brought up the contemporary aspect. And that you are in conversation, that's worthwhile being in conversation with the latest scientific whatever, even if it's on the other side of the aisle. Because otherwise, I mean, I think Corbin was like that. I mean, he was living a life. He was living a real, genuine, wonderful, passionate life, and not answering questions. He was living a life not answering questions. He was living a life being in the imagination, which is what Hillman says about him in The Thought of the Heart. So there you go. This was really fun for me. I'm now completely exhausted, and I have to go cook dinner.
Sure.
But yeah, thanks for having the interest in Corbin and in my work. I appreciate it. And if you'll all send me your emails, I'll put you on my little list, and you can get in touch with me, and I will, if I have time, respond to you. But enjoy your enthusiastic, imaginal lives, because the world is that wonderful place.
Tom, if you have the energy, that's okay. If not, but can I ask a question?
You may.
Thank you. See you later.
Yeah. Thank you. It's really been a delight, this conversation. And I guess the question I wanted to ask is sort of autobiographical in a way, or just how you approach things. Like what would you say about your approach to reading and learning and teaching? Because you have had this very unique path, and you read quite broadly, and you've produced work in fields that you aren't qualified for. That's quite good and helpful to people. And I'm just wondering, either at the micro level of like, what does your day look like, or at a level of kind of making decisions? How is it that you do what you do?
Well, I can actually kind of answer that, but only sort of historically. Well, first of all, I didn't write the first book on Corbin until I had exited academia. I was at this little college in Pennsylvania, very little college in Pennsylvania, which was a good experience for me. It was a women's college. I was there for 9 years. I got tenure, and then I quit. And I quit for a few reasons. It was a good place to be for me. It was really good because it was so small that you could make up your own curriculum, and it was really good. So I taught both biology and humanities, and I taught at Corbin once even. But for reasons that are not pertinent to this discussion, we decided to leave. So I didn't ever have the problem of, some department chair wondering what in the hell I was writing. Had I stayed at Wilson, I wouldn't have had that problem either, because it wasn't that kind of school. It was real small, and as long as you were teaching well, they didn't care what you did, so that wouldn't have been a problem there. On the other hand, I think personally for me, I really, I wrote the first book for myself, and I wrote the next couple of books for myself. And the bad part of that is that it was compelled. I wrote them because I kind of didn't have a choice, and not in a really good way. I was really struggling with my psychological issues and my complexes and my and in ways that sometimes made sense to me of the questions that I was approaching Corbin with. Other times it was just compelled, and as the years went on, I guess there's 5 of them, they were freer and freer, until I got to the end of the last one. It was like, oh shit, I can't write anymore, and I completely lost my compulsion. So that says something. I mean, it's not very helpful in one way or another, but they were always written out of need of one sort or another, sometimes really intense, other times just curiosity. The chapters in whatever book they're in on the cyclical time essay were, I really ought to read that thing again because it must mean something. And that was pretty much a head trip. But also by then I knew Corbin well enough to connect it. But then there was another essay, and I can't remember which one it is, that was written out of incredible personal pain and anguish. I went over and over and over, and I would write a sentence if I got 2 sentences a night, I was really happy. And it answered. It was working through a psychological issue. And it wasn't like when I finished the essay that I felt, the therapy had been successful. But not that long afterwards, I thought, oh wow, I'm not gonna have that existential anguish anymore because I worked it through it was from this book, I think. I worked it through with Corbin running through Ibn Arabi's doubt. They say, the figures say to Ibn Arabi as he's circumambulating the Kaaba, he says, oh, what if these angelic figures don't exist? So it's a moment of existential anguish. And they show up and they say, oh man, we're fine. You're the one with the problem. And when Corbin does that, I worked through that to such a point where I finally got, oh my God, Nietzsche's claim God is dead. how inflated could you possibly be? So, you know, they're saying, Ibn Arabi, man, hey, we're fine. All's fine here. I work, you know, that. So otherwise, right now, I'm not writing. You know, I'm not writing. I'm reading little bits. So I wrote a book of poems that I published afterwards, and I thought, this is answering your autobiographical question. A year or so after I finished Imaginal Love, I had delivered to me poems over the course of just a couple of months. And I sent them out and they published them, which was pretty great. And I've never been happier in my life. And I thought, well, this is exactly what I was hoping for. You know, I get to the end of Corbin and I become a poet. And then they stopped. That is, they became mechanical. And I realized, oh man, every time I sit down to write a poem, I get a different poem, but it's the same thing. And so now I think I'm looking, you know, I'm just sort of looking for something in the world to light up. And if nothing does, then I'm pretty happy. And if something does that calls to me, I would like to write about it. So that's an honest answer to your question.
No, thank you. The honesty is really great. You know, I've experienced you know, mental difficulties and anguish related to writing, and it's nice to hear somebody talk about that, and someone who you know, I admire their writing as a product, and to see that you can get that sort of product, and
Yeah.
the process isn't pretty.
No, but it can be therapeutic.
Mm-hmm,
you know,
mm-hmm,
I mean, it really, I mean, it's very hard if you're in a situation where you've got deadlines and whatnot. And
yeah.
none of my writing was under those sorts of circumstances.
Yeah.
You know, so it was really, really pretty fantastic situation. And during the time I wrote all of those books, or at least most of them, I had a day job that didn't take any of my brain. You know, I made money, I got paid, I had insurance, and then I wrote the books. So it worked out pretty nicely, really. Except what I missed was discussions like this, because I didn't have people to talk to about it. Which anyway, it's good. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah. Thank you for making the time, certainly, and
thank you for inviting me. I am delighted to have done it.
Mm-hmm.
My wife will tell me what we're having for dinner, and I will cook it. It will include fresh corn on the cob.
That sounds delightful.
Yeah.
All righty.
I will sign off. Thank you. Stay in touch, please.
Yep.
And I think people are chatting at me, Jared, as to what the emails are, and you make a compendium, would you, and send it to me?
Yep, that's what I was thinking. I can definitely.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Perfect.
But if you guys want to stay in touch, just do. That'd be great.
Perfect. Yeah, that
Thank
would be
you.
wonderful. Certainly.
I had a good time.
Yeah, likewise.
It's rare to talk with people who have been through the book so intensely and who really are operating on that level. So it's really great. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck to all of you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, have a good one.